very close friend of mine has a hypothetical question. Suppose,
Hypothetical.
yes,
Take a step.
a very close friend of mine, and
Okay.
his question is that
Is his name David?
I can't remember. I can't recall that. But at any rate, he had a very devout. He davened Shachris, but he davened the Yachid. So he had a very, good davening session. The long for Hu Rachum and everything. And then he realized that his yarmulke had fallen off his head. Now, what did he do wrong?
In other words, he never was wearing a yarmulke the whole time?
Yep. I think it broke off during Hatzitzis.
So, several thoughts come to mind. One thought is that although the yarmulke has become a very important symbol today, the yarmulke is not and it's become, very important today. Lots of mystical and halachic discussion has become attached to the yarmulke, and I'm not downplaying the significance of the yarmulke. It's very, very important on one level, but it's not an essential piece of ancient Jewish clothing. The yarmulke itself was considered sort of representative of head coverings that pious people wore, people identified as Hasidim, by the Gemara, wore. And eventually it became a piece of clothing for every male. And today it's considered, even by the fact of your question, you can tell it's considered to be so essential that to not wear one is considered, that the question even arises is an indication of how important a piece of clothing that it's become. But it was never early on considered an essential piece of wear for the average person who was communicating with God. And so on the one hand, you could say that it doesn't take away from the power and meaning of what the person did, because they don't have a yarmulke. From that perspective, from the fact that it wasn't originally considered necessary equipment. If somebody would ask, the famous thing is, and we've talked about it, did Yaakov wear a yarmulke? So the answer is, of course he wore a yarmulke. It says, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva. Yaakov left Beersheva. You think he'd leave Beersheva without a yarmulke on? So it's a joke, but nobody really thinks that Yaakov wore a yarmulke or Avram wore a yarmulke or anybody like that. They may have, because of the actual garb of the place, they may have had some kind of head covering as protection from the elements. But so that's on one level. There is another level of this, which is that it's been my own experience. I say this from experience, not necessarily from a text learning, but from my own experience, that there are times when I think I had an elevated moment. And so I think I've also shared this with you. There was one time where I was learning Breslov, some Breslov materials, stuff from Rav Nachman, and it was on a Friday night. I was by myself in a Breslov shtibel that just had a lot of Breslov Sforim there, and I was learning, I think, something from Likutei Moharan, and I was like flying. I was absolutely flying. And then I got back to my dorm room, and as I walked, it was actually an apartment. When I got back to the apartment, the first thing I did was flip on the light, and it was on Shabbos. So I think it was a kind of moment of humble reflection that sometimes I think I'm having a very elevated experience and it's not elevated. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm not saying that's what happened to your friend, but I'm saying it's a possibility also that it's a kind of humble reminder that although it felt like something deep was going on, it may not have been that deep. Every once in a while, I believe it's useful to have humble reminders, because when we have an elevated experience, or we think of it as an elevated experience, the next wave is arrogance. And arrogance could almost undo the value of the elevated experience. So this is, I believe, there are these stories of Rabba Bar Chana. I think it's one of the stories of Rabba Bar Chana. It may not. It may be a story of Rabbi Akiva. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe a story of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, I think this is a story of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva went overboard on a trip on a boat. He went overboard, and later on, and I think they were shocked to see him alive. They thought he was for sure dead. And then he told the story that while he was floating in the water, there was a board, a piece of wood, and he grabbed onto the piece of wood and he floated on the wood. And I think this was the same story where he said that there was a first wave, and he ducked his head, and he made it through the first wave. But after the first wave, there was a second wave, and that wave was much bigger. And he also had to duck his head in order to survive it. Now, that's either a story of Rabbi Akiva, or it's a story, the two-wave thing is part of a Rabba Bar Chana story, but somebody had that experience. So the way that story is interpreted is, the Vilna Gaon said that the first wave is surviving, I think, some kind of challenge. Whatever challenge is, you survived the first challenge, or you did a particular hard mitzvah. But then the next wave comes, and it's much bigger, and that's gaiva. That's the arrogance that comes after you either do a mitzvah or overcome some kind of challenge. And so it can be very strong. So it could be, I always think of these as like a gift from Hashem that allows you to have a quickly humbling moment after you've had a deep moment, in order so that you don't succumb to the arrogance that can follow a very deep moment. So that's,
I follow that. But moving from the deep to the shallow, did I do anything like bracha alotdafna? When I said the Shema, was I not fulfilling the Shema? Was there anything that I not me? I mean, my friend. Would he have done anything?
I refer you back to answer number one. There is no, if you did not fulfill the Shema by doing this, then most of Jewry did not fulfill the Shema up until modern times, because most of Jewry did not wear a yarmulke until modern times. It was just considered the clothing of the pious. So in the Mishnah, At the time of the Mishnah, when they're talking about all the laws of the Shema, most people are not wearing yarmulkes, including righteous people. You had to be considered a pious person to be wearing a head. And same in the Gemara, same in the, at some point that switches, but to say that it switches to the point where you don't fulfill the mitzvah, I would find that surprising. Now, nowadays, if you're Hasidish or Yeshivish, it's not enough to even wear a yarmulke. You're supposed to wear a double covering, and and that means even like for even a hat on top of your yarmulke. And there are mystical reasons for this notion, and it has blended even into some halachic discussion. But certainly, first of all, to not be wearing it by accident, it just would be shocking to me to think that anybody thinks you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. It would be different with tefillin, for instance. Like tefillin, there is a special notion to be wearing tefillin and tzitzis and a talis or tzitzis when you say the Shema. So if, let's say, you didn't have your tefillin on when you said the Shema, you're counseled to repeat the Shema later on when you have tefillin. And because there is some special notion of saying the Shema with tefillin and tzitzis on, but because they're mentioned in the Shema. And so, but as far as a yarmulke goes, this is all theoretical. In the theoretical realm, I am suggesting that, especially since it happened, nobody could accuse you of trying to change common minhag or anything like that. It just happened by accident. So I do not believe that there's anything like that. I mostly go for the number 2, which is, even without knowing it, you can use it as a way to humble yourself. It's useful, very useful, especially after you have what you believe is a profound spiritual experience. It's very useful to have something that brings you down so that you don't get arrogant, because the arrogance about spirituality can be, it could be worse than not having had the spiritual experience.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. So last time we talked about Shabbos. And what we call Lekadesh is Shabbos, sanctifying Shabbos. And this is in that ballpark of sanctifying the new moon or the calendar. And the Rambam had made the distinction that the calendar or the new moon is sanctified by the Sanhedrin, but Shabbos is sanctified by each one of us. And so, and then last time I talked a little bit more about Shabbos and its holiness. And one interesting point before we go on to Chametz here is a thought of Rabbi David Foreman, may he live long and in good years, about the first Shabbos mentioned in the Torah. He suggested that we don't get a glimpse into God's private world in Tanakh. When we talk about God, we tend to be talking about how we perceive God or how he wants to be perceived by us. not his internal workings, but how he interacts with us. Like if you wanted to characterize Tanakh, you might characterize Tanakh as a kind of manual on our relationship with God and the world. So we're given enough information to enable us to interact with God, but you could say not in a model of this is our relationship with other people. We never really see the inner workings of another person. Even when a person tells us about something that's going on inside of them, they're translating it. And we end up hearing it through many filters, and by translating it, they're also using filters. So we're not getting a direct look inside of another person, typically. For most of the people that we know and we interact with, we only see what is outside of the person. We sense that there's a spirit behind those eyes, and maybe in some elevated moment we see that what is behind their eyes is a spirit, but we don't really see into the nature of another person. So that is certainly the case with God. We don't get a glimpse into his inner workings, but he doesn't really even share his inner workings. That's our position, that's our tradition, that's our vantage point when we hear God talking to us, that we're not getting a sense of what's really going on in the innermost part of God. But there is an exception, Rabbi Foreman suggests, and that's when God characterizes Shabbat, the experience of the Sabbath, which is at the beginning of the second day. Not the second day, in the beginning of the second chapter. So it starts, thus the heavens and the earth were finished and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day. We talked about that last Wednesday, from all the work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all the work which God created and made. So this discussion about the fact that he rested and then blessed the day and sanctified it, he suggests, although it's very coded and cryptic, he suggests that it is a glimpse into God's world in a way that we really don't get. It's a kind of rare moment where you get a glimpse into God's inner world, which he's sharing for us ostensibly so that we can model it later on. But so anyways, okay, now we're on to chametz. How he chooses where to put everything. He's not doing this in order. In other words, he's not going through the Torah, and when a mitzvah comes up, he talks about it. He's got a system for how he puts things together. Some of it you can see more clearly in why one follows another. And if we were talking to the Rambam, he'd have a clear explanation for how one thing is following another. Certainly these are related because they're still in what we call the moadim, which are the sacred moments in time, which allow us some kind of special moment of connection with God. So they're in that group, but exactly how it works otherwise. If you do look at the unfolding of the mitzvot, of the holidays in the Torah portion of Emor, which is in Vayikra, in Leviticus, where it talks about the holidays, it does mention Shabbos first, and then it mentions Pesach. So that Shabbos would become before Pesach, you could say, is itself modeled in the Torah. But anyways, He shetzivanu leva'er chametz mibatenu. We are commanded, this is mitzvah 156, we're commanded to destroy chametz from our houses, biyom arba asar minisan, on the 14th day of Nisan, v'zuhi mitzvahs hashbosas saor. This is the mitzvah that is characterized in the Torah as the destruction of saor. V'hu amru yisbarach, ach biyom arishon tashbisu saor mibotechem. And this is that verse where God says, but on the first day, destroy saor from your houses. V'hinei hizbaru dinei mitzvah zu b'perek rishon psachim. The laws of this mitzvah are explained in the first chapter of Psachim. They are from the Torah portion of Bo El Paro, and they're mentioned in the Rambam's codes in the sections Manim, times, Hilchot Chametz and Matzah, the laws of Chametz and Matzah. So, first of all, now I would like to see how, in this one, it uses the word chametz and then leaven. He chooses the word leaven in English. In most likely, what Saor is referencing is sourdough. In Egypt, they cultivated the recipe for sourdough. It may have existed in other places, but apparently Egypt is considered the first civilization that really robustly adopted sourdough. Interestingly, it may be a byproduct of making beer. When I was reading up on it, Moishi and I actually spent some time reading up on sourdough at one point. During the different times when I was looking at it, the thinking was that first they were making beer, which has similar ingredients. It has, let's say you're using a grain, let's say you're using something like barley. So you create this kind of soup with the barley, and in that soup with the barley, what you're really cultivating is yeast. Yeast is growing. It is eating the sugars that are coming from the breakdown of the barley, and one of the byproducts of the sugars is gas, is air or gas. And so in the case of beer, though, one of the very important byproduct is alcohol. So in the case of beer, the yeast is eating this other stuff and it's producing alcohol. And then you take that, you mix it with water, and eventually you end up with beer. But the gas is the carbonation. That's why beer is carbonated. And this is all coming from the yeast. So one of the belief is that one of the byproducts of making beer was that they found that their bread rose. And that was also the gas that was being released by the yeast as they're eating the sugars. I don't know why there's no alcohol involved in it. I'm sure there's some reason why there's no alcohol involved in it, but there is the raising of the bread because of the gas produced by the yeast. So in Egypt, they had cultivated it. It had become one of the options in Egyptian life. And we were commanded to stay away from that during this holiday. There are places where this holiday is called Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of matzah. Matzah is bread that it was not given a chance to rise. Matzah is not necessarily wafers or crackers. Matzah is just bread that wasn't given a chance to rise. The matzah could be this thick, In fact, almost all the bread in the Beit HaMikdash and in the Mishkan was matzah. And those showbreads that were on the table are matzah, even though they are thick. They're like a hand's breadth thick, and they were very big. So they would have they would be doughy and everything, and yet they're still called matzah. So the sort of enemy here is the leavening agent, which is the yeast. Now, so in sourdough, what happens is you have natural yeast that's just floating in the air. If you leave dough out, the yeast will be attracted to it. Just yeast in the air will be attracted to it. And then eventually it will grow a colony and lots and lots of yeast, and then the bread will start to rise. But to reliably get risen dough, they would create starter dough, which was dough that had been left to really intensely colonize the yeast, and they would have this powerful concentration of yeast, which would be in the form of a piece of dough, which they would add to a regular dough, and it would be the equivalent of the modern day practice of just taking a packet of yeast and then putting it in some warm water, letting it flourish a little bit, and then putting it in with the dough. This is a relatively modern process, the adding a packet of yeast. It's only cultivated yeast. It's something that's only been going on for the last couple hundred years. Up until then, if you wanted risen dough, you had what they now call sourdough, which was made from one of these starter things. So most understand saor to be starter dough. That's starter dough. So when it says destroy saor from your house, most specifically, it would be referring to that dough which would cause bread to rise. So any dough which would cause bread to rise, in its most narrow definition, would be called starter dough. Or saor. It would be called saor. So, so when you're saying remove the saor from your house, in its most limited understanding, it would be the starter dough. But as you see from here and other places, it's understood to broadly mean chametz, which chametz is risen dough. Any risen dough, even if it's not as potent, and you wouldn't think to use it as starter dough, but any dough that has risen dough is called chametz. So if you have in your house something that is risen dough, it is a mitzvah to remove it from the house. It's a fulfillment of the mitzvah to get rid of all risen dough from your house. Now, when you think of risen dough, you think of bread, but it actually could be a product of any of the 5 grains, which are wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. So anything that would be called risen dough or from any of those would certainly require destroying. And then it's understood that it doesn't actually have to be in dough form, but any of those grains that have had a chance to interact with water and been given an opportunity to develop, yeast or etc., are said to also be chametz, and we've developed many sort of fences around this. So as we all know from our experiences before Pesach, there are a lot of things that would not be considered proper for Pesach that are far from the notion of starter dough. But that's how it begins, and then it gets expanded. On some levels, the expansion is still considered part of the biblical command. Then there's an expansion that's part of a rabbinic command, and then there's expansions that are part of custom. So even the custom not to eat kitniot, which are grains or vegetables which are not clearly not from the 5 grains, but could be, looking back, this is how they understand the custom. They either could be mixed with the other grain, or they could be mistaken for the other grain, or make something that would be mistaken for chametz. So there are items that are considered kitniot, and that's a custom. That's an extension of this by custom. Certain cultures do not have this. So for instance, rice on Pesach, there are certain cultures, mostly it's distinguished as Ashkenazic cultures, which do not eat rice on Pesach, and Sephardic cultures who do eat rice on Pesach. It is sort of interesting that if you sort of tabulated the different places that eat rice on Pesach, they tend to be places where rice is considered a major food staple. The places that do not eat rice on Pesach tend to not have thought of rice as a major staple. Like as an Ashkenazi Jew, an American, Western, suburban-raised Ashkenazi Jew, I had rice every once in a while. We had rice as a side dish. When I married Tzipi, I discovered that rice is served every day. With any major meal, rice is served. And her family was from Syria, and this is true of many of the Sephardic countries and many of the North African countries, that rice was an important staple. So it's sort of interesting that the issue of whether you can have rice or not, which seems to have been about something different, could divide along those lines. Now, I'm sure there's exceptions, but think of a culture where rice is considered an every meal item, a staple. Think of find one that doesn't eat rice on Pesach. I can't think of one. Okay. Number 157. That is that he commanded us to tell about the exodus from Egypt on the night of the 15th of Nisan, at the beginning of the night, according to the speaker's linguistic abilities. It is better for one to add upon the telling and stretch out the words by magnifying that which God did for us, what the Egyptians did to us in terms of injustice and oppression, and how God avenged us upon them, and to thank him, may he be exalted for all the good which he benefited us. It is like they said, anyone who is expansive in his telling about the exodus from Egypt, behold, he is praiseworthy. And the verse that appears about this command is his saying, and you shall tell your son on that day. There are actually 4 different places that talk about telling over the story to your children. They become the foundation for what's called the 4 sons, but this is the one he picks. The word haggadah seems to come from that verse. Vihigadata, and you shall tell over, seems to be the key word that upon which the haggadah is named. And the explanation comes to say, and you shall tell your son, perhaps from Rosh Chodesh Nisan, hence this is actually in the Haggadah, hence we learn to say on that day. Perhaps while it's still day, hence we learn to say for the sake of this, which is the matzah and bitter herbs, are resting before you, meaning you recount it at the beginning of the night. And the language of the Mechilta is, it is implied from its being stated when your son asks you, perhaps if he asks you who you tell him, hence we learn to say, and you shall tell your son, even though he doesn't ask you. I only know at the time that he has a son. if he is by himself or with others? How do I know that you still tell over the story? We learn to say, and Moshe said to the people, remember this day, meaning to say that he commanded them to remember it, just like he said, remember the Shabbos day. So we have, just like there's Zohar as Yom HaShabbos HaKadro, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it. Here we're supposed to remember it, and this would apply whether you have kids or not. And you already know the language of their saying, and even if we are all sages, all understanding, all knowing the whole Torah, it is a commandment upon us to tell about the Exodus from Egypt. This actually, this might just be the author who's showing that it's from the Haggadah, and I'm not the author, the editor. And the regulations of this commandment have already been explained at the end of Psachim, see Parshas Bo, Mishnah Torah, leavened and unleavened bread. All right, we're going to come back to this mitzvah. There's a lot here, and we all have a lot of experience with this, and certainly some input on it. There's a lot here, but it's interesting. This is just one detail. There was one time where I was in a restaurant at Mizrahi Grill, and I was studying with a class, and Rabbi Albin was there, and he was studying with this guy named Chuck, who I got to meet over the years. And it was not uncommon for Rabbi Albin to call me over to ask me a question, mainly to demonstrate to Chuck that what he's about to tell Chuck, nobody knows this, or somebody, the average person wouldn't be thinking this. This is something the average person wouldn't know, or an average person wouldn't be thinking. And so his example of an average person was me. He would call me over and ask me the question, fully expecting me to get the answer wrong. And reliably, I did on many occasions. Every once in a while, I did have the answer, though, to his disconcertment. Anyways, so he asked, what is the purpose of the Haggadah, of telling over the story of Magid? So my answer was that the purpose is so that we can feel that we are going out of Egypt, as it does say in the Haggadah at one point, to which he said, wrong. And then he pointed out, and the minute he said it, I knew he was right, that the purpose is to get to the point where we can praise God for taking us out of Egypt. And even the Rambam, the way he characterizes this, he says, anyone expansive of the telling of the Exodus, behold, he is praiseworthy. Oh, that was before that. So what do? It is better for one to add upon the telling and stretch out the words by magnifying which God did for us, what the Egyptians did to us in the form of injustice and oppression, and how God avenged us upon them, and to thank him may be exalted for all the good with which he benefited us. So it's the thanking him, the praising him, or Hallel. If you look at the Magid section, it ends with Hallel, which suggests he was saying it. And then when you see things like this, it suggests that ultimately, if you ask yourself, what's my goal in telling the story? What's my purpose in telling the story? Why am I telling the story? It's to get to a point where I recognize the greatness that God did for me, and I praise him for that goodness. But the praise at the end is the goal. Okay, we'll talk more about this and other things on tomorrow, but I do want to, I neglected to say this at the beginning, but I was thinking that our learning today is in the merit of those, of the hostages. May they have a speedy and healthy return, the healing of the injured, the comfort of the bereaved, the protection of our soldiers, the protection of all the people in Israel, and all of us abroad. And Hashem should end this speedily, and we should only see peace from it. Okay. Be well.
Yes,
Rabbi.
thank you.
Be well, guys.
Yeah, Amen. Rabbi, I just want to tell you that everyone that I've been communicating with in Israel, they all say they're worried about us in America. They read so much about the anti-Semitism all the time, so.
It does tell you about media.
Yes.
Media, I think at the core of media is our desire to be somewhere else. Why are we consuming it? Because we want to be somewhere else. So it's part of the effectiveness of media that they take us somewhere else. We're never
Yeah.
here. We're always there.
That's
And
right.
so when you're in Israel, you're suffering the terrors of living in America. And when you're in America, you're suffering the terrors of living in Israel. When you ask somebody in Israel, how are things? Not bad. It could be in the middle of a war, but they're going, it's basically okay. We are in a war, but it's basically okay. It's certainly not what they're portraying on television about here.
Yep.
We're not having that experience. And then when they think about Chicago, forget America. How about Chicago?
Exactly.
Chirac.
Exactly.
We're in the midst of all the killing and the shooting. It's terrible. Okay, be well, guys.
Thank you.
All
Bye-bye.
right, bye-bye.